August 16th, 1:09 a.m., 1:10 a.m. I got done today exactly what I said I would do. I added the little bit of extra tutorial for using the dodge mechanic in the game. Let me show you that right here real quick. And don't worry, I'll explain why I'm up so late in a second. So yeah, not much of a big deal. Basically, you miss an attack and whoop, use control to dodge. There it is. So that's it. Nice and simple. I have not uploaded this change to Steam yet to update the demo. I'm gonna do that tomorrow. Haven't had a chance today to actually make sure I thoroughly test the whole demo again, that I haven't added anything that has broken anything since all the changes I made since the last time I updated the demo. Yeah, and my new GPU is on the way. My replacement GPU for my RMA, so it's coming on Monday. I'm pretty excited about that. Now, as for the rest of my day, it was a very nice day, very beautiful weather. I did my usual, I hit the gym, I was feeling really great today. The reason why I'm up so late, though, is not because I got carried away with anything stupid today. What did I do earlier first? Oh, right. So at one point in the day, I actually had another burst of inspiration when it comes to writing some dialogue for my game. So I wrote out another scene worth of dialogue that I'm really happy with. And then I added this new little tutorial thing for the dodge mechanic. And then I went outside to enjoy the weather. And I ended up writing a couple more scripts for my promotional campaign that I'm still working on. I'm planning tomorrow to experiment with that a lot. I'm just gonna quickly test out the demo, upload this change, and then when that's all good to go, I'm going to I think spend pretty much the rest of the whole weekend finalizing my exact idea for how I'm going to be doing these upcoming videos. I really need to get on the ball on that. So yeah, that's what I did. And then I went outside. Right, so then I was outside, I was doing all that. And I did my usual meditations and all that kind of stuff that I like to do. And then I saw that my buddy Shane was out there, who I've mentioned previously. And he was hanging out with some other guy there. I want to say his name was Stevens? Stevens? Anyway, so I met his buddy that was there and hung out with them. And then, it's a Friday night, and given how much I work and how little I go out and do anything, might as well take the opportunity to chill and socialize again. So I think I was out there for at least a couple hours, maybe even 3 hours. Just hanging out and talking to these guys. And I just got back, and that's why I'm up so late. So it's all good. It's a Friday night. Cut myself a little slack, and tomorrow I'll get back on the ball. Clean my apartment. Upload this new update to the demo, and then get those videos figured out. Excited to start shooting those and figuring out exactly what I want to do. I probably will need to order the equipment for it that I mentioned. I need a new wireless microphone, possibly some lighting stuff, but I have an idea for how I might be able to do the lighting without that, so we'll see. Yeah, that's pretty much it. The only other thing I had that I think was worth mentioning, it's kind of an interesting thought that I had today. For some reason, the idea of inflation popped into my head. I was thinking, why do we want inflation? Because I was thinking purely in terms of the reason inflation happens is that there's too much money in the money supply. And so I thought, wait, why do we ever cause that to happen? Why don't we just do our best to maintain the same money supply in the economy all the time? So I go to ChatGPT and quickly ask it, like, yo, why does inflation happen? And first of all, it enlightens me to the obvious fact that I should have realized at first, that there are other kinds of inflation, lots of different kinds. Prices can get inflated because of some bottleneck on a resource, which then affects the prices of everything else, or because of changes in demand or whatever. There's like all kinds of different reasons. It's not just the money supply. And the reason why the central banks will raise or lower interest, or rather keep interest rates at something that's not like just 0% all the time, is in fact because you want at least a little bit of inflation, because it actually has an incentivizing effect for the economy. It encourages people and motivates them to invest more and to take risks on opening businesses and things like that, because you want to try to outpace the inflation at all times. So it acts like an economic stimulus to some extent, as long as it doesn't go too far. But then as I start going back and forth with ChatGPT and talking about this and learning more, it occurs to me that the only reason this makes sense is based on the idea of never-ending growth, of a perpetual need to constantly keep growing the economy and producing and consuming. That if it wasn't for that, there would be no need for inflation at all. It's based entirely on that idea to keep things constantly moving. And the more I started to think about that, I started thinking about other things I remember hearing about a long time ago, like how economists had predicted that, or some, I think Keyes specifically predicted that we would only be working 15-hour work weeks by this point in the future. And I'm thinking to myself, why would anyone have ever thought that? If the whole idea of economics is to maximize productivity and growth, to no matter what, don't ever let it go into deflation, don't ever let it go into recession, and so on, there's no point at which ever you would want people working less hours. And in fact, the whole idea is to keep things constantly growing out of a fear of what will happen if you don't. And then I thought to myself, well, there's other problems with this as well too, which is like, well, okay, what I started to actually think about is that if you really wanted to reduce working hours and make life simpler, there's no getting around the fact that you would have to be willing to sacrifice productivity for more comfortable lifestyle. More comfortable in the sense of having more free time to yourself, not more material things, but you trade off how many material things you can have. So collectively, if workers decided, yeah, we don't want to work 8 hours a day anymore, we want to work 4 hours a day, that can work. It's just that you have to accept that the economy won't grow as much as it did before. And you won't be able to get as much stuff, which, I don't know, maybe is fine. I suppose it's up to each person to decide for themselves whether or not that's a good idea, but I think it's a good idea in the long run, insofar as we have a fundamentally limited amount of resources on Earth. And if we just perpetually try to grow things forever, we're obviously inevitably going to run out at some point. And then I was thinking about how this would only work. You wouldn't even be able to do this on a national scale. Okay, a lot of different things occurred to me. First of all, that the people who have the incentive to do this the most are the richest people, because they need to have access to as many workers as possible, and they need to be able to have access to that for as cheap a price as possible. And if you're a regular person who's, let's say, decides just for yourself, you want to give people the freedom to decide for themselves, okay, you know what, I don't mind if I have less stuff, but I only want to work 4 hours a day instead of 8 hours a day. You realistically can't do that, just because, or at least most people can't, because you can't go and get the equivalent of a $60, $70, $80, $100,000 salary, but be like, yeah, but boss, I only want to work half the day. Most jobs where you can make that kind of money, which is I think what most people would consider to be sufficient enough, require you to work full time, whether you like it or not. So it's not realistically possible to just make the choice to be okay with not being quite as productive as other people, but okay, fine, I just won't have as much stuff. That's okay, I'm happy with that. You can't even really do that because the entire system is designed in such a way where the people at the top, the rich people, have the most incentive, and the most power and the most ability to keep everyone working as much as possible because they need that for their own enrichment. So the only way it would work is if everyone collectively got together and demanded that we don't want to work 8 hours a day anymore, we only want to work 4 hours a day. And then I was thinking about how this on its own, without any violence, without any kind of eat the rich rhetoric or redistributing wealth, would automatically also shrink the gap between the rich and the poor, because the rich would now have way less workers to choose from because people aren't willing to work as much, and they can't sell as much of the stuff they do make because people just don't have as much demand for consuming things anymore. They aren't as obsessed with it. But of course, I also realized that this would require people to culturally shift their mindset in an unprecedented way. It's not enough to just think, and to me, this is where what I thought was interesting about this and what occurred to me is when people, it feels like most people now, when they call themselves left-leaning, when they call themselves socialists, when they want to redistribute wealth, it seems like they want to have a society that's exactly like the one that we have here, but we just like take stuff from the rich and redistribute it to everyone else. But it seems to me that that doesn't actually solve any problems. I think there's two problems with it. First of all, it seems to me like on some level, those kinds of highly motivated, super obsessed with making money rich people who know what they're doing business-wise are necessary. They are, to some degree, fundamentally important to the functioning of the economy and to pushing it to its limits. And you can even see in practice how it backfired historically in almost every society that tried to forcefully redistribute wealth in that way. And at the same time, I just lost my train of thought. Yeah, okay. What I was trying to say is I'm just mentioning how most people, when they think of, it feels like now in the United States, and especially among young people, where it's become more trendy to be socialist or leftist, they want things to be the same as they are right now. They just want things to be redistributed. But I think it's contradictory because actually the reason we have as much as we have and the reason why we produce as much as we do is because in part of those like psychopathic style people at the top who want to push everyone to work as hard as possible because they're like that and because they want to make as much money as possible. If you disincentivize those people from acting that way, people won't be as productive and we won't have as much stuff. And then you'll be more pissed off in a different way. And that's the end result, as we've seen both historically and I think theoretically that makes sense. And that the only way that this would actually work, if you're like, I'm tired of this lifestyle, I don't want to work the 9 to 5, 8 hours a day anymore, I only want to work half as much time. This is only possible if everyone collectively agrees on a trade-off. The trade-off being, and it's like a total shift in mindset. The trade-off being that we won't have as much stuff, but we also won't have to work as much. And we have to switch our mindset away from basing our quality of life on how much stuff we have and instead basing it on almost any other factor. Of course, the problem with this, many problems come with this, one of which, another one that occurred to me was, this wouldn't work even if you could do this on a national scale. Because then what happens is other countries won't do this. They'll keep working the 8 hours a day, let's say. And because they're more productive, they will have more resources to put into their military, which means now they can boss you around. You are vulnerable to them potentially if they want to take your resources. And it doesn't have to be a full-on war, even just propaganda-wise. They fundamentally have more resources to sow internal political discord in your country, to do all kinds of things to mess with you. And you won't be able to defend yourself anymore because you're not producing as much stuff as them. So this would also only work if it was a united worldwide, all workers uniting together. So I can't help but think that this is just another thing that's convinced me that the things people are arguing about all the time economically, most especially between capitalism and socialism, they're not real arguments. Like they all just want to they all really actually want kind of like the same system, and they don't understand though that the way it works now is really the only way that it can work. And if you actually wanted to solve problems like feeling overworked, feeling like you don't have meaning in your life because everything revolves around consumerism and so on, it actually requires you to fundamentally accept a lower standard of living. And it doesn't even require redistribution of wealth in any direct way. It's just that collectively we would all have to agree that this is how we should do things. Now, I think that would be the smart thing to do just because we have limited resources, and this is a very obvious, inevitable problem we're going to run into. And this has led me to the conclusion that I think we will end up in a more equitable society one day. But I think the reason that'll happen is because civilization will collapse when we eventually run out of resources or we get dangerously close to it and there's not enough to go around anymore and people start to freak out over it. And then when we rebuild civilization, the main lesson we'll have learned from history is there are limited resources and we can't function the economy according to growing as much as possible. Instead, it has to be based on other measurements, like other forms of measuring quality of life, for example, whether or not most people have access to basic necessities, and perhaps expanding on that from there. But either way, it wouldn't be based anymore on endless growth. And so, ironically, I feel like, well, I don't know if it's ironic, but it feels like the kind of Marxian prediction that the progress of history was going to lead humanity to a socialist, communist type of society. I don't think it's going to be socialist or communist per se. I think it's going to be like a mixture between those two things, where you'll still want the most innovative, hardworking, motivated people at the top, kind of like how you have in capitalism, but they'll be working perhaps not as much for profit, but more for like social status or something like that. But at the same time, the economy wouldn't revolve around growing as much as possible anymore, which is how things work now. And that's the thing. That to me is the weird distinction, though, is, and this is why I was saying why, like, I think the argument between like socialism and capitalism is actually irrelevant. Because if you become a socialist country today, let's say, and I think this is also, again, what happened historically, is you will produce less stuff. We've seen that that's what happens. Your economy will be weaker, and as a result, you are not able to compete with the capitalistic societies. And it is, if only for that reason, you're inevitably going to fail. And that is the sense in which socialism doesn't work. But capitalism doesn't have to be about endless growth either. And that's why I don't believe capitalism is really the problem. The problem is the way that we live our lives, the social and cultural values that we have. Capitalism, so far as I understand, doesn't mean anything more than that people are free to run their own private enterprises and businesses and to trade with each other however they please. That does not mean, therefore, your life must revolve around maximizing as much stuff and things as you possibly can. It's just that I think we end up doing that because we are monkeys. I think the reality is the problem isn't capitalism or the system. I think the problem is our primitive nature is such that I think human beings still are mostly basically like monkeys, and most people are too stupid to grow beyond that right now in this point in evolution. I think most people don't have the self-awareness. When I think about everyone I've ever known in my life, I think the majority of people don't really change much past the age of like 18. I think they don't have enough self-awareness, and I don't think they know how to control themselves or their primitive instincts. I think even for very intelligent and self-aware people, it can be hard to control those instincts. And if that's the case, then that means the problem here, regardless of the system you put in, has nothing to do with like the system itself. It has to do with something born in to us naturally that will lead every system into some kind of fucked up direction, because we're always chasing after power and social status and money and so on. And you can mess around all you want with trying to create different incentives for different things, but I think all of those traits will ultimately show their face one way or another. And I think if it were possible, in theory, to form a properly functioning, more egalitarian society, we would be able to do so even in a capitalist mode of production, because that would be a reflection of values and not about the system. We would be able to function capitalistically with private enterprises in a way that is careful and considerate, and where we find and look for a balance between a quality of life and economic growth, as opposed to nonstop, never-ending, constant productivity, gotta make as much money as possible. All that matters is having as much stuff as possible. And I think that problem gets even worse when you consider today, more than ever, especially in the secular Western world, how much more socially isolated people are, how much people don't have as much belief in anything anymore. I mean, even like in religious belief, for example, like I think even half the people who call themselves religious nowadays, it's like a childish superstition. It's not like this real all-encompassing aspect of their life. I think that local communities are largely lost, and people increasingly live only for themselves and only in the most primitive, animalistic, non-self-reflective way. So imagine if tomorrow, even hypothetically, everyone wakes up and decides, actually, I want to live a more chill life. I want a life that revolves more around like a soulful quality of life, revolves more around my connections with other people, and with having a relaxed life where I'm not just constantly chasing after the next thing I can buy, or praying and hoping that I just won't lose my house tomorrow or whatever. I think if you woke up and everyone was trying to do that together all at once, I think people wouldn't know what to do with themselves. I think most people are just so, like I said, like we're just so fundamentally like monkeys, and we are so directionless at this point, like the average person, that the idea that any kind of egalitarian system could work in the face of these kinds of traits that we have naturally built into us as animals, and which we haven't evolved out of yet, is just naive would be an understatement. So anyway, kind of cynical talk here, I guess. But I thought this was interesting from an intellectual point of view, just because it comes across to me like everyone is talking past each other, and all these conversations people have and debates about this stuff is all nonsense and bullshit. None of this really comes down to what economic system works, and I don't know what the fuck works, what it even means for like capitalism works or socialism works, or what. It depends on the metric that you're using to measure these things. And realistically, I think the overarching theme historically and what you see now is nothing more than it's just like all of our most primitive monkey-like impulses being pushed to the extreme. That, I think, is the overarching like average trajectory of the human species at this point in time. If you tomorrow were to give literal fucking chimps the ability to speak and think in more complex ways, I suspect the first things they would do would be pretty much the same things we do, and not much of anything different. And the kind of careful foresight and planning and intelligence that a person is required in order to be able to grow into someone of extremely high moral integrity, let's put it that way, I think this is fundamentally lacking in society as a whole. And I think the average person isn't capable of these things. And I think because the average person isn't capable of these things or of discerning them, the people in the highest positions of leadership are themselves also not really people of that caliber either. Anyway, like I said, I just thought this was interesting. Not to be cynical. To me, this is just an honest evaluation of the situation. And I think things are going to work out in the long run. I think it's just going to be a very painful process, and I think it's going to work out only because we will be forced to learn from our mistakes, and not because we will do any kind of truly careful planning in the long term. And yeah, and I think if humanity survives the next few hundred years and rebuilds, and I think that's what's going to happen. I think there will be a collapse and then a rebuilding. I think it is that new era of humanity that is really the one that's going to be able to make us into a properly global civilization and send us to the stars. It's not going to be these fucking Elon Musk clowns or anything like that. These dudes who just go around and do whatever the fuck they want, and you know, for all the boasting of like electric cars and stuff, are simultaneously doing just as much damage and continuing the cycle of endless extracting of resources and all that kind of stuff. You by the way, you even look into things like this is the problem with this consumerist stuff. You even look like there. Oh yeah, this was another point that I was considering as well. Is there isn't really any kind of technological solution to any of our problems either. Even in the most optimistic scenario, the discovery of nuclear fusion, free energy, the most efficient ways of recycling things. None of this could possibly be enough to save us from all of our problems. We still constantly use and throw into the garbage all kinds of resources that have a fundamentally limited amount that at one point or another we will run out of. And there will be fights over those things. And when humanity becomes accustomed to living at a certain standard of living and suddenly it's not able to do so, people are going to freak the fuck out. I could be wrong. I don't know. Maybe there's technologies I can't even dream of that will come into existence that will somehow solve these problems. Maybe it'll solve itself through some well, I mean, in a way, I guess this is almost what I'm talking about, though, is like some kind of population collapse happens, but one way or another, like something has to happen that forces people, I hope, to hit the reset button and consider that things have to be done differently. And they have to be done differently not because there's a problem with the system, but rather that we have to have a complete shift in how we think about things and how we live our lives. And I don't think anyone's going to do that anytime soon unless they are forced to do so. So yeah, anyway, just thought it was interesting that I think most arguments about between modern day self-labeled socialists and capitalists and so on, I think everyone's arguing nonsense. I think most people, like everyone wants what we have right now. People just have arguments over how we should better redistribute what we have. But really, it has nothing to do with our fundamental underlying issues. The real problem is we all think and live our lives in a way that is unsustainable and which will inevitably kill us off. Or will it inevitably lead us to a collapse of civilization and forcing us to have to completely reorganize and rebuild under a new paradigm, a new system of values in which we value above everything else, protecting the sustainability of our societies. It's almost like the complete opposite of what we do now. Protecting the sustainability at the expense of growth. But so long as we're all divided with countries, so long as we're all obsessed with having bigger militaries, so long as your average person is obsessed with having more and more stuff and social status and so on, so long as there's always some dude who's going to take your job if you're not willing to work it and so on, like there is no way of stopping this machine. I think we're just too monkey-like for anything like that to happen. And I think the arguments between different economic systems that people think of now are all total nonsense that have nothing to do with the fundamental problem, which has way more to do with just the nature of human beings, and really nothing to do with the system. I think if you put the properly morally oriented people into any system at all, they will figure out a way to make things work. And if you put a bunch of monkey-brained fucking clowns into any system, what you end up with is a fucking circus. And I think the latter is the current accurate description of human beings. For all the great things that we do, I don't think we are all that evolved beyond our primitive animal form. And I think if you think carefully about everyone you've ever met and your experiences in life, and including yourself, I don't know, man. That's how it looks like to me. All right, that's all I got to say about that. I didn't mean to go into so in depth and rambling all over the place. But for anyone who's been watching these, thank you for bearing with me. I hope you enjoy my random thoughts and ramblings. And all right, I'm gonna go to bed. Peace.